All right, let's dive into another deep dive. Something you all have been asking about, how to use data storytelling to, well, to really get your point across, make a real impact, especially with that big presentation coming up about student success. And we thought, who better to learn from than Ryan Smith,
Oh, yeah, Ryan Smith.
the Director of University and Assessment at Illinois State University.
Yeah, at Illinois State.
He was featured on the Friday SLO Talks podcast.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
And he really had some interesting things to say about making data work for you, not against you.
Right, yeah, because it feels like sometimes it's working against us.
Totally. And it's kind of ironic because, higher ed institutions, we've got tons of data.
We're swimming in it, but we don't know what to do with it half the time.
Right. It's like having a library full of books, but nobody knows how to read.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
And he actually had this story about working with an art program, and they wanted to use data, but they just completely froze when they were given this very traditional assessment plan.
Oh, I can imagine.
Lots of grids, charts, the whole 9 yards. It just made everybody anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that doesn't really help when you're trying to get buy-in from people.
No, you need people to be on board, right? So how do we do that?
Well, that's where this whole idea of humanizing the data comes in.
Yeah.
And Ryan's a great example of this because he actually started in art history
Oh, wow, interesting.
and then moved into quantitative methods. So he really gets that even people who are comfortable with numbers sometimes need a different approach. It's not one size fits all.
It's not, and that makes a lot of sense because I can see how people would shy away if they feel like they're not a numbers person, quote unquote. So what's the secret sauce? What's the alternative?
Well, that's where this idea of data storytelling comes in. How do you turn those spreadsheets into something that people actually connect with?
Ah, okay. So instead of just showing people numbers, tell them a story, something that they can actually latch onto.
Exactly. Because we're humans. We're wired for stories, not just for rows and columns.
And that makes sense if you think about like books and movies. I mean, we love stories.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that Ryan said when data is presented as a story, people are less likely to question the methodology. Like they just sort of trust it more, I guess.
Interesting. So it's not about manipulating the data, right? You're not trying to cherry pick or anything. It's about finding the story within the data.
Yeah, exactly. And using your expertise, what the data means to kind of highlight the trends, illuminate the so what, and really make it meaningful.
That makes sense. So like good data analysts, good data storytellers, they're not just presenting the information, they're helping people understand what it actually means and what to do with it.
Right, exactly. And he made this distinction, which I thought was helpful, between exploratory and explanatory data visualization.
Okay, so two different approaches. Break that down for me.
Yeah, so exploratory, think of like those big interactive dashboards, It's more about letting people kind of dive in, explore on their own terms.
So it's like giving them the tools to kind of discover their own insights.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas explanatory, it's more like you're guiding the reader. It's more author-driven. You're taking them through these specific insights. You're using smaller, more targeted visuals.
So kind of like a well-crafted short story. You're the author, and you're guiding them through a very specific narrative.
Yeah, and he gave this great example, I love this, of like the vacation day map, which is this simple, really clear visualization that just showed how many vacation days people were taking. And you just got it immediately.
Got it, yeah.
Wow.
So if I'm trying to get my point across about, say, student success, I'd probably want to lean more towards the explanatory approach. Would you say that's right?
Probably, yeah. Especially if you're hoping to inspire some specific actions based on the data.
Makes sense. So how do I do that? Like, how do I tell a data story?
Well, Ryan had this great framework, these steps for crafting a data story.
All right, lay it on me.
Okay, so first, you got to identify the problem you're trying to address. What's the core issue you're trying to solve, the question you're trying to answer?
Got it. So in my case, it'd be something like, how do we improve student success at our institution?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay, what's next?
And that you need to know your audience, right? Who are you trying to reach with this story? What are their backgrounds? What do they care about? What are their priorities?
So it's kind of like tailoring the message, right? Making sure that it's going to resonate with the specific people you're talking to.
Exactly, yeah. And then define the purpose of your story. Is it to discover something new, to inform people about a situation, to educate them about a specific topic, or to inspire them to take action?
So in my case, it's definitely about inspiring action to improve student success.
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, last step.
The last step, and this is crucial, is the call to action. What specific steps do you want your audience to take? based on what you've just shared.
Okay, so don't just leave them hanging with a bunch of information. Give them a clear path forward, something to actually do.
Right, exactly. So let's look at some examples of how Ryan actually put this into action. He had some really compelling stories about turning basic charts into these really powerful narratives. Like, for example, remember that one about first-year student satisfaction,
Yeah, I remember that.
where he focused specifically on the percentage of students who reported just a fair experience. So instead of just showing overall satisfaction, he honed in on that specific trend.
And made it a clear area for improvement. I see what you mean about telling the story, like highlighting a very specific point that you want people to pay attention to.
Exactly, yeah. And then there was that amazing story about time poverty.
Oh, yeah, that one was really interesting.
That really debunked the myth of the, quote, lazy dropout, right?
Right, because a lot of those students who aren't returning, they're actually juggling jobs and families, all sorts of other responsibilities.
They're not lacking motivation. They're facing some real barriers.
Yeah, and that story really illustrated how data can be used to change the conversation, to challenge those assumptions that we often make.
Yeah, and he had this really interesting point about using titles for your visualizations that are actually calls to action.
Ooh, I like that. Tell me more.
So instead of just saying, like, sense of belonging by race ethnicity, try something like disparities in belonging by race ethnicity point to needed transformations.
Yeah, just that small change completely reframes how we think about the information.
Exactly. You're not just presenting data, you're advocating for change. And then, this is kind of cool, he even showed how a chart with no difference can be a powerful story.
Wait, what do you mean? No difference, like nothing changed?
Yeah, he used the example of a chart comparing student outcomes for hybrid versus in-person learning, and it showed basically no difference between the two.
Okay, interesting. So like a flat line.
Right, but in that context, it actually meant that faculty had successfully adapted their teaching to these different modalities.
Hmm.
So it became a story about effective teaching and institutional resilience.
I get it. So it's all about how you frame it. Even the absence of a trend can tell a compelling story.
Exactly. So the takeaway is to really think about, like, what is the message? What is the story I'm trying to tell here? And how can I use the data to support that?
So you have to be creative with it. It's not just about crunching the numbers, it's about thinking about the bigger picture and how to use data to drive real change. And I mean, speaking of driving change, one of the biggest challenges in higher ed is getting faculty buy-in. So I'm curious how data storytelling can help with that. What did Ryan have to say about engaging faculty with data?
Oh, he had some really good stuff on that.
I bet he did, but we'll have to save that for part two. So where were we? Ah, yes, engaging faculty. It's a big one, right?
Huge, absolutely.
So how can data storytelling help with that?
Well, one of the things Ryan emphasized was shifting the focus from just presenting data to faculty to actually inviting them to tell their own data stories.
Oh, that's interesting. So like flipping the script a little bit.
Exactly. Instead of saying, here's the data, what do you think? It's more like, what's the story behind this data?
Oh, I like that. So it becomes less about top-down reporting and more about collaboration.
Yeah, and he gave some great examples of questions that you could use to kind of prompt faculty to think about data in this way. Like,
Hmm.
uh, you know, what data point or trend has surprised you lately? Or what's the story you see emerging from this data?
Oh, that's good. So starting with curiosity, right? Pique their interest.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because then it becomes less about, this administrative burden and more about, like, their expertise.
Right, and their perspective, which is really valuable. So by encouraging faculty to share their own data stories, you can create a more data-informed culture, a culture where data is seen as a tool for, reflection and improvement rather than just accountability.
Yeah, and that actually ties into another point Ryan made about the importance of tailoring your data visualizations to different audiences. A chart that's really clear to a data analyst might be totally confusing to someone who doesn't have that same level of expertise.
Yeah, totally. You have to speak their language, right?
Right, exactly. So he had some good tips on how to do that. Like, one thing he suggested was to ditch the legend on a chart
Oh, interesting.
and just use series labels directly on the graph.
Oh, I see. So, like, instead of having to go back and forth between the legend and the chart, the information's right there in front of you.
Exactly, it's just way easier to read.
Yeah, sometimes those legends are so cluttered, it's like, I don't even know what I'm looking at.
Right. And he also talked about removing unnecessary data points. Like, if you have a tiny percentage labeled poor on a student satisfaction survey, taking that out might actually make the story clearer and more impactful.
Yeah, sometimes less is more, right? It's about focusing on the key takeaways.
Exactly. And then he talked about using colors and shapes strategically to kind of reinforce the narrative. Remember his example about the visualization about women in Congress?
Oh, yeah, that was a good one. He used the shape of, like, congressional chamber for the chart.
Yes. That visual echo just makes it so much more memorable. And of course, you want to make sure your title clearly conveys the main message, like that great example he gave about transforming a simple chart about sense of belonging.
Oh, yeah. How did he rephrase that?
Instead of sense of belonging by race ethnicity, he changed it to disparities in belonging by race ethnicity point to needed transformations.
Oh, that's so much better. It's not just stating a fact, it's calling for action.
Exactly.
So when we're thinking about faculty specifically, what kind of data stories are most likely to resonate with them?
Well, he suggested focusing on stories that either highlight areas for improvement or that kind of showcase unexpected insights.
So like that example we talked about earlier about the chart showing no difference between hybrid and in-person learning.
Yeah.
At first glance, it's like, okay, so what?
Right. But Ryan reframed it as a success story, a story about faculty effectively adapting their teaching.
So it became a celebration of their hard work and adaptability.
Exactly. Faculty are busy, they're bombarded with all kinds of demands, so it's important to show them that their efforts are making a difference. And that data can be used to celebrate those successes, not just to point out problems.
That's really key, I think, because sometimes data can feel punitive. It's like, oh no, here comes another report card. But if you can frame it in a positive light, highlight the good things that are happening, that can be really motivating.
Totally, yeah. And he also talked about just being really transparent and genuine with faculty. Building that trust is so important. And that means acknowledging the limitations of the data.
Yeah, because data isn't perfect, right?
Hmm.
There are always going to be gaps and inconsistencies, and it's important to be upfront about that.
He actually shared this, kind of a cautionary tale about how he learned that lesson the hard way.
Oh no, what happened?
He presented this data about student satisfaction rates without really consulting the affected departments first.
Oof, yeah, that's not going to go over well.
And it didn't. It really highlighted the importance of being sensitive and collaborative when working with data, especially when it's data that involves people's performance or perceptions.
Yeah.
Data can be really personal.
Absolutely. So how do we do that? How do we be more sensitive and collaborative?
Well, he gave a great example of how he did that. He talked about how when he was sharing information about sense of belonging, he actually consulted with experts from disability services, the Multicultural Center, all these different departments to make sure he was using appropriate language and presenting the data in a responsible way.
That's a great example. So it's not just about the numbers, it's about the people behind the numbers.
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the technical side of things and forget that data ultimately represents real people's lived experiences. So how can people go about developing their data storytelling skills? What did Ryan have to say about that?
Well, he emphasized the importance of letting go of that academic mindset that often prioritizes complexity and jargon.
Yeah, it's so easy to get bogged down in all the technical stuff and forget that the goal is to communicate clearly and effectively.
Right. And Ryan himself, he's not a math person. He said he's never taken a computer science class, but he's become a successful data storyteller by just embracing that continuous learning mindset.
And he talked about how he's always got YouTube or LinkedIn Learning open on a second screen, constantly seeking out new ideas and inspiration.
That's a great tip. So anyone, regardless of their background, can learn these skills.
Totally. It's about being resourceful and never stopping learning. And he also stressed that humble expertise again.
Right. So recognizing that you don't have all the answers.
Exactly, yeah. And being willing to learn from others. He mentioned Stephanie Evergreen and Ann Emery, but also emphasized that you can just use Google or YouTube and just type in your questions. There's so many resources available. And connecting with communities of practice.
Right. Because we don't have to do this alone. There's a whole community of data storytellers out there who are willing to share their knowledge and support each other.
Totally. And he had this funny story about how he just Googled Stephanie Evergreen, what's the right chart for this kind of data?
That's great. Even the experts are still learning. It's a good reminder that we're all in this together.
Absolutely. So now let's switch gears a bit and talk about some of the broader questions that came up during the Q&A portion of the podcast.
Oh, yeah, this was interesting. They really got into some of the challenges and opportunities of data in higher ed.
Yeah. One of the big questions was how institutions can actually track student incomes after they graduate.
Oh, that's a tough one. That whole return on investment question.
Exactly.
So what did Ryan have to say about that?
Well, he's actually had some success with matching student data with state labor market records.
Oh, that's smart. So looking beyond the institution's own data systems.
Exactly, yeah. There are a lot of valuable data sources out there that we might not be thinking about. And he also mentioned this federal project, I think it's called the Post-Secondary Employment Outcomes Initiative, or PSEO.
PSEO, okay.
And they're working on creating a more comprehensive system for tracking student outcomes.
Oh, that would be amazing. It would be so helpful to have a more standardized way of measuring this stuff.
Right. And then he reminded us that the college scorecard also has some income data, although it's not at the individual student level.
Yeah, but even at the aggregate level, that data can be helpful, for understanding broad trends, maybe demonstrating the value of specific program.
Totally, yeah. And then another big topic that came up was just the challenge of choosing the right assessment tools and technology.
Oh yeah, there are so many options out there. It can be totally overwhelming. So how do you narrow it down?
Well, Ryan really emphasized the importance of aligning your choice of tools with your specific institutional goals and needs. Don't just jump on the latest bandwagon or whatever.
It's about finding what works best for you, not necessarily what's the most popular or the most expensive.
Right. And he also said it's okay to start small, like focus on doing one thing really well rather than trying to implement a bunch of tools at once.
Oh, I like that. A lot of times we try to do too much too soon, and then we end up feeling overwhelmed and discouraged.
Right. And he used this analogy of a smartphone, saying that all smartphones kind of look similar on the outside.
Right, they all have a screen and buttons and stuff.
But the apps and how they're organized make each phone unique.
Right, it's all about how you personalize it, how you make it your own.
So in the same way, we can create this basic framework for assessment, but then allow for that flexibility and customization to meet the needs of different programs and departments.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's not about finding the one perfect tool. It's about finding the right combination of tools and strategies that work for your institution. And speaking of strategies, one thing that really struck me throughout this whole conversation was this tension between the demands of data collection and the desire to use that data meaningfully.
Right. We're all drowning in data, but are we actually using it to improve student learning?
Exactly. And there were some really powerful comments from participants in the podcast about the need to involve faculty in the process, to shift the focus from accountability to improvement, to actually make data work for us, not against us.
Yeah, Daphne, who's both faculty and an administrator, she said, if we know information that can result in more effective student learning and we don't do anything with it, shame on us.
That's a powerful statement, and it really gets to the heart of the matter, right? Data isn't just about numbers, it's about people. It's about making a difference in the lives of our students.
Absolutely. And one participant even suggested that instead of pushing data onto faculty, institutions should invite faculty to share their own data stories, creating a more collaborative and engaging approach to assessment.
Oh, I love that. It flips the script and puts faculty in the driver's seat,
Yeah.
recognizes their expertise and gives them a voice in the process.
Exactly. And it all comes back to that core principle of data storytelling, finding the human element in the data and using it to inspire action and drive positive change.
Okay, let's pause here for a moment to gather our thoughts. We'll wrap up this deep dive in part 3 with some final reflections and a thought-provoking question to leave you pondering. All right, so back to data storytelling. We've talked about a lot from crafting a compelling data story to thinking about the bigger picture of data in higher ed.
Yeah, it's been a really rich conversation.
It has. So as you're prepping for that big presentation on student success, what are some of the things that have really stuck with you?
Well, one thing that really resonated with me was Ryan's emphasis on, the power of storytelling to really make data come alive.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's not just about the numbers themselves.
Right. It's about connecting with people on a deeper level, on an emotional level, and inspiring them to take action.
And that makes sense, right? Because stories are what we remember. They're what stick with us.
Totally. So I'm already thinking about how I can kind of reframe some of the data points that I want to share as stories.
Oh, I like that. Give me an example.
Okay, so instead of just showing a chart of student success metrics, maybe I could highlight the individual journeys of a few students, students who have overcome challenges, achieved their goals.
That's a great idea. It puts a human face on the data, makes it more relatable.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't always have to be me telling the story.
Right. Bring in other voices.
Yeah, I can think about ways to empower students and faculty to share their own data narratives.
Give them a platform to share their experiences and insights.
Exactly. It's more authentic that way.
And more engaging for the audience. You could even incorporate like student testimonials or faculty reflections, or even create some interactive data visualizations that let the audience explore the data themselves.
That's a good idea. Kind of like give them the tools to become data storytellers themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
I also really appreciated Ryan's advice about embracing, what he called humble expertise.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It's so easy to get caught up in trying to be the expert, the one with all the answers.
Yeah.
But really, there's always more to learn, right?
Always. And that's the beauty of it, right? It's a continuous journey.
Totally. And that's why I love that he talked about always having YouTube or LinkedIn Learning open on a second screen, just constantly looking for new ideas. It's that kind of like, lifelong learner mindset.
Yeah, always be curious, always be learning. And I think that's a great takeaway for all of us, not just for data storytelling, but for everything. So to wrap things up, we wanted to leave you with a final thought-provoking question, something to kind of, ponder as you continue on your data storytelling journey.
Okay, hit me with it.
So here it is. How can we use data storytelling to not only drive change at the institutional level, but also empower students and give them a voice in shaping their own educational experiences?
That's a great question. It really challenges us to think about data in a whole new way, not just as a tool for assessment, but as a tool for empowerment.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, we want to thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We hope you've gained some valuable insights and inspiration to start crafting your own data-driven narratives that will make a real difference in the lives of your students.
And remember, anyone can be a data storyteller.
Happy storytelling.